The content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional, medical, or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical or mental health condition. Welcome to All Start, where we share our story, listen with compassion, and connect through our faith and mental health experiences. Following this story, Morgan and I will offer insights that connect faith and mental health. We invite you to practice listening and understanding during this episode so that when someone shares their story with you in real time, you'll be ready. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's start this journey together. My name is Heather, and I'll start. So my biggest fear about sharing my story is that people won't believe my experience. That, when I share details about what it's like to be me, that they'll minimize the impact that it has on my daily life because some of them seem so simple. But another fear I have is also that others will use then my vulnerabilities once they know them against me. They'll use my difficulties maybe as an excuse to discount my good qualities, or my character or my value, really. And so it's really scary to reveal those struggles with people because it means that I'm allowing other people to see the many parts of myself that I've tried really hard to hide for a really long time. When I am struggling with my mental health, I have thoughts about being defective or being inadequate. And I really believe that everything that I'm experiencing is my fault. So I blame myself a lot. But I think sharing those fears with trusted people, it's essential because even though it's really scary, someone might recognize just a little piece of themselves in my experience and maybe then find some hope. Or maybe it will even help parents or teachers who are listening to understand a child who struggles in the way that I did. One clear memory I have where I noticed that I was maybe different from other children involved me being a part of a church program called Awana. And if you don't know what Awana is, it's sort of like a program for children, and you learn scripture and sing songs and play games and things like that. And so, every single child that was a part of Awana, at least at my church, looked forward to, all the energetic games in the gym that we would play at the end of the night. But for me, that was so overwhelming. I remember during relay races and group games, the noise and the chaos were so stressful to me that I would hyperventilate. And I would eventually just beg to sit out. And I found relief in that. But I also felt deeply isolated. And I felt so different from other people. And I would just sit on the sideline and I would watch the other kids laughing and having the greatest time of their life. And I was over here, pretty much living my worst nightmare. So by the time I hit 6th grade, my struggles became pretty undeniable, and they showed up or started to come out in a different way. And I started having trouble with math. We were learning the new concepts of algebra. And I remember my teacher having a parent-teacher conference with my parents, and he told us during that conference, Heather will never grasp math concepts. She will never be successful without, constant help, and she will need a tutor once she reaches high school. And I remember I was a part of that conversation, and I was sitting there and listening and hearing, what he was saying. And, I'm sure that he was extremely nice. But, what I heard as a 6th grader was that I was dumb, that I was not smart, and that I would always need help. And there was really nothing I could do about it. And that set me on a path that, if I'm not smart and there's nothing that I can do about it, then why try? So in high school, by then I had to find a way to cope, and I coped in 2 ways, really. I coped by hiding in humor, and then also hiding by fading into the background. And I used humor, like self-deprecating humor. And I want people to know that I struggle and that I'm okay with it, or I want it to appear that I'm okay with it. I do think there's a positive in that. I think it's important that we find humor in some of our quirks and things. But sometimes laughing at myself is a way to gain acceptance from other people. And it turns into people pleasing, and then it ends up to hiding who I really am. And so especially in high school, I became really angry, and I know depression was definitely starting to affect my ability to cope and to keep up, and started to affect, how I viewed myself. I really felt bad about who I was. I kind of wanted to hide in a classroom. I was very anxious to be called upon. I remember always wanting to sit in the back of the classroom, always wanting to go unnoticed. I would get lost in the lesson, my mind would wander off daydreaming. And I was really often misunderstood. People would see my distractibility or daydreaming as acting like I didn't care. And so they'd interpret that behavior as defiance or having a bad attitude. And, I really didn't understand it either. So a lot of times I would get in trouble for not answering the question or not having the answer. And I really didn't understand why I was getting in trouble, because I really just didn't know. And so teachers would make these comments in front of the entire class. And I was so ashamed. And that shame turned into anger and a lot of depression. But a real turning point for me came with my math tutor. She was so kind, and she would sit with me at her kitchen table twice a week. And I remember one time her saying to me, just out of the blue, as I was working, Heather, you realize you don't actually need me, right? You know this information, but you just struggle to remember how to apply it. And she just showed me and told me that I wasn't incapable, that I just needed some support. And just her kindness, her ability to see me, to really see me, it profoundly changed my self-perception. So when I started college, my struggles only intensified. I started out as a music major. I loved singing, and it was just something that I had always excelled at in high school. And, I received a scholarship for voice, and that was really awesome, right? But when you are in a music program You have classes and lessons and training, and I tried so hard. But as hard as I tried, I could not get it together. And the more that I didn't show up for things, the more I forgot about things, the harder it became because of the shame that it caused. And, my professors would say things on my reports like, if you just showed up, if you just practiced harder, if you put in more work, you have so much potential. And, by the end of my sophomore year, I was pretty much failing the major music courses that I needed. And I didn't know how to do any better than what I was doing. And it was absolutely devastating because this was a time for extreme comparison for me. I was surrounded by other students who seemed to be able to do just fine, to excel even. And I was trying so hard to do those same things, but it just seemed so much harder for me. And I felt broken, and it just really led to some pretty self-destructive behaviors. So at the beginning of my junior year, I ended up switching my major. And I had started taking some psychology and sociology courses, and those aligned with a lot of my interests and a lot of my strengths. And so for the first time, I really started to excel. I also met my husband during this time, and that was really transformative because he also encouraged me and he believed in me and just kind of helped reshape how I saw myself and some of my capabilities. So after graduation, life really stabilized for a while. I even went on, I earned my master's degree, I got married, and I really thrived. I had learned a lot of really great coping skills, like the importance of routine for me, and how to sleep, and how to eat well, how to plan ahead, and what to do when I'm overwhelmed. And I was just thriving. But then, about 10 years into our marriage, I had twins. And suddenly, those everyday tasks became incredibly overwhelming again. And, some of that was to be expected, right? Because, having twins is just insane. But I started struggling with things like grocery shopping, getting gas in the car in time, making doctor's appointments, just simple things like that. And because all of my brain power was being used up in caring for these two little babies and my growing toddler, and suddenly these very basic things seemed so impossible. And some of that inadequacy and those deep emotions from when I was younger just started to resurface. I remember one time I knew I needed gas in my van. And so, I had two babies and I had a toddler. And if you think about all the little steps that it takes to get out the door, everyone needs shoes. Maybe you need a coat, And then remember, the bottles and the diaper bag and the snacks. And I just needed to get gas in my van, in the tank, because it was on empty. And so I did it, right? And I just remember I was so proud because I managed to do it. I managed to get to the gas station, and I pull up to the pump and I start pumping gas, and it goes click, it's done. And I go to pay and I realize I don't have my wallet. This kind of thing happened over and over and over and over again. I would leave my wallet in the cart while grocery shopping. I would use my debit card and I would put it in the back pocket, of my pants, and I would forget to replace it. And so I'd have to order a whole new card. I mean, these situations happen to me so often. And I just remember sitting there at the pump and just sobbing because my husband was working. I felt so alone. I felt so helpless. my babies were crying, my toddler's crying, and I just felt like this really terrible mom. And I think for the first time, I felt like it was impacting my family, it was impacting my kids, and it just felt like it was all my fault and that I was letting everybody down. And I had a friend at the time, and I called her on that day that I was at the pump having a complete meltdown. And, she had twins as well, and she would come and she would, pay for my gas, and she would follow me back home, and, she'd make me laugh, and she would remind me who I am, that I am a good mom. Man, she's a real gem. But, right around that time, I had been attending a group for moms at my church. And a mom leading it at that time invited me to lead it. And, despite my doubts, I couldn't even remember to grab my wallet to pay for gas, But despite my doubts, I said yes. And somehow I discovered that I had some leadership skills that I never knew existed. And it was because someone saw something in me. She believed in me. It was like I just needed that start so that I could maybe start to believe in myself. And I just started kind of realizing that, it's okay to ask for help. I had this amazing team of women helping me lead, and they were so gracious. And I was learning that I didn't have to be perfect to be useful. So also at that time, I returned to counseling because I was still feeling pretty awful. I was barely functioning some days. And I started taking medication to treat the depression, and that really helped. It started to take the gray cloud off of my day a little bit. And it helped me slow things down so that I could think and get a hold of my emotions. But there was still this peace, I still couldn't remember things. I was very unorganized. I was losing things constantly. I just felt like I was going crazy. So she recommended that I have some testing done. And when I sat down to get those results from the psychologist, he completely validated my whole lifelong struggle and just really clarified why certain things had always been so difficult for me. And at one point he said, Heather, you're in the 98th percentile for ADHD, the inattentive type. And that roughly means that you struggle with these symptoms of ADHD more than 98% of the population. And that was so incredibly validating because, it confirmed how hard things are for me. But it was also just so sad. I felt a huge sadness for my 6th grade self who sat there and was told she will never learn anything and not knowing why. So I felt immense relief because I finally knew what it was. It brought clarity to so many things. I finally understood some of my limitations, and I was starting to understand also some of my strengths at the time. While I struggle to focus on one thing at a time, the reality is that I actually focus on too much at once. I get so much input all the time in my brain, it's so easy to get overwhelmed. But really, it's this overdeveloped ability to notice. And I've been in so many situations where I notice things or I pick up on subtle things that other people don't notice. And so for most of my life, I have honestly felt like that was some sort of curse. But as I've gotten older, there are some times when that really has its advantages. I remember one time all of this understanding, my whole story, just kind of came together. I'd put off singing or any kind of music for about 10 years because I just had considered that, that wasn't for me. I had chosen a different career path, and, when I tried to sing, it only brought up grief. But after almost 10 years of not singing, it was something that I just had this ache in my heart to do. And I missed it so much. I remember one Sunday, I was singing at church. It was maybe like the third or fourth time that I had started singing again since I had joined the worship team at church. And I was just feeling super awkward on stage. And, I'm still trying to get my footing. Like, I just feel like I don't know where to stand. Like, where do I put my hands? Like, how do I, it's just, when you're first starting out, it's so uncomfortable. But I had my eyes closed because sometimes I do this to try to focus. And I was just like asking God, like, can you use me? And all of a sudden, I just felt this sudden urge to just like open my eyes, And I look out in the crowd, and instead of seeing just like this blob of people, I just took a moment to just sort of skim the crowd, and I started to notice actual faces of real people. And, they're all looking back at me, and that can be really overwhelming, but I just started skimming, and I was seeing people just worshiping and pouring their heart out to God. I was seeing people crying. These are people I know their stories, I know their struggles. And I just started feeling so grateful for my ability to notice. And I really think that worship, for me, brings all those things together. I feel like worship is a time I can use my ability to notice, to care for people, send those prayers and requests and needs up to God. And then God inhabits the praises of his people. It's this kind of like cyclical kind of like experience. And I feel like in those moments where I'm obedient to that call to worship, God uses how he uniquely created me. All of my struggles, all of my gifts for a purpose. Sometimes it really is a struggle. There's never a day I wake up and not have ADHD. But I think if I'm obedient and I trust that God is going to use all of the parts of me, my struggles and my strengths, because they all come from him, it brings me so much hope. And so if you are listening today and there's any part of you that questions how you were made or feels broken or somehow defective, let me tell you, God can redeem that. And he's really the only one who can. If you're listening and you have a child that struggles in similar ways, please don't give up hope on them. Please speak encouragement and kindness to them, because their story isn't finished yet. And God can use those struggles and use those unique challenges for so much good.
Hey everyone, welcome to the post-story discussion of All-Star. I'm your host, Morgan Arsenault, and today I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Heather Kalopek. Heather, first and foremost, thank you for sharing your story. It really takes a lot of courage to open up, especially about something so personal. And so how are you doing right now?
Thank you, Morgan. It feels... it feels good. It feels good to finally share it. Vulnerability is always a bit scary. But at the same time, I think that there is so much healing in it. It's one of those things, you carry these stories with you, but letting it out, letting people see you for who you really are, can be freeing.
Absolutely. And I think you've shared something that many people can relate to, and your story is so powerful. You talked about your ADHD diagnosis and how it affected the way that you saw yourself and how you started to believe that you were defective. And that really struck me. And I want to speak to that for a moment because so often when people feel different, it can lead to shame or to self-doubt. But through our faith, we know that we're all fearfully and wonderfully made, right? We are created in the image of God. And you shared earlier how the words that others spoke to you shaped that belief. And so let's dive in. I want to ask, how did you overcome that feeling of feeling defective? And what can people struggling with similar thoughts take away from your experience?
Yeah, I think, for most of my life, I believed that there was something wrong with me. And that really challenged my faith. ADHD, at least the way that I experienced it, wasn't something that was widely understood, especially in women. I was often told that I was lazy or just not trying hard enough, that I had so much potential, but somehow wasn't, living up to that potential. And so, but over time, and especially after being diagnosed later in life, I started to see that, ADHD isn't a reflection of my worth. It's just a part of who I am and how my brain is wired. And so, that wasn't easy. That belief in my own defectiveness took years and even comes back now. I still work on that. But it takes years to challenge. And it was only through this lens of faith and my relationship with God that I've been able to really start the healing.
I love that perspective. It's so important to remind ourselves that our value is not based on the world's standards or even the way that we perceive our struggles. Romans 12:2 says this, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." And I think that's key. It is a mind shift. It is a perspective shift. By filling our hearts and our minds with what is true about who we are in Christ, we can start to view ourselves and others more accurately. ADHD or any other challenge, it does not make us defective. It makes us uniquely gifted. So for our listeners who may not fully understand ADHD, can you break down how it affects your everyday life and, how does it impact your relationships, your work, or even your faith?
That's a great question because every day I wake up, I will have ADHD. And so I want to say that ADHD can look different in everyone. But for women, it is often overlooked or misunderstood. And for me, it's not just about being distracted. It's the mental exhaustion of trying to focus when my brain just won't cooperate. I often feel like I'm running at full speed, but I'm just not getting anywhere. Like I'm on this treadmill that is just going full speed and I can't get off. And so, at work, I have developed strategies like, setting timers or reminders. I break tasks into smaller pieces because, if I don't, I will forget things, or I just get so overwhelmed by the sheer amount of things that I'm juggling that I just kind of shut down. But in relationships, especially with my family and my friends, it can be tough because, I might forget something really important. I might forget to return a text. I might forget your birthday. I might forget, some details or timeline of things that have happened in your life. And so I can come off as disconnected, which can be hard for people who don't understand ADHD. I've had to learn to communicate more openly about what is going on in my head so that people are aware, because sometimes they just don't understand. And in my faith, I've learned that, God doesn't call me to be perfect. He calls me to be faithful, to show up and to trust in Him, even when I feel like I am falling short.
That's such an important point. And really, you've touched on something that is not often discussed, and that is how ADHD in women can be so different from how it's traditionally recognized in men. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, typically when we think about ADHD, we think of hyper little boys in school, right? And I think it's important to understand that, women often hide their symptoms or they internalize their symptoms. And so many women don't get diagnosed until later in life, like, in my case as well. And so it's not just for women this struggle to focus or to stay organized. It's also about emotional regulation. And so the overwhelming feeling of being too much or not enough, that's all happening at the same time.
My heart just goes out to your 6th grade and high school self and how those experiences could have been so different, had you known what you were actually dealing with. But I'm so thankful that God has used all of that for good. And I think about the work that you do as a therapist with kiddos and how you have the unique perspective because of your experience to really speak and to see them and to meet them where they're at.
That is such a good callback because, so many times I just wondered, God, why did you make me this way? And having struggled myself for so many years, I have this deep empathy for anybody who's struggling. And now looking back in hindsight, I can see that God, he uses those experiences, as difficult as they were. He uses that as something that sets me up for and prepares me for the work that I need to do now as a therapist. ADHD, mental health issues, they can be a challenge, but they're not a sentence to a life of failure. There are so many strategies and supports available, whether it's therapy, medication, or just understanding more about your brain and how it works differently. And so, it's okay to ask for help. Sometimes just recognizing that you're doing the best that you can, that's enough. And that can be a huge step.
Absolutely. As we wrap up today's discussion, I just want to remind our listeners that what we say matters. Our words have the power to shape how we see ourselves and also others. And Heather, I'm so grateful that you're sharing your story because it's not just about ADHD, but about how we all can find grace in our struggles and see our worth in God's eyes. And so thank you for being so open and for showing us that even in our weakness, God can work in powerful ways.
Thank you, Morgan.
And to our listeners, remember that transformation begins in the mind. Be intentional about what you fill it with because your words matter, your life matters, and you matter.
Yes, and thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on All Start.